Lolita Buckner Innes stood by the window of her office as the dim morning light slowly seeped into the corners of the room. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but within her, everything was unnervingly still. She had poured her youth into the climb, not out of a hunger for status or wealth, but out of a pure devotion to the work itself. And yet, all that remained now was a deep and consuming disappointment. It felt like she had been left behind, as if the value she had once brought to the table had quietly faded from everyone's memory. Her beginnings had been anything but easy. She had started her career at a major marketing firm where every assignment was a battlefield and victories were only granted to the relentless. She began at the bottom, but her persistence carried her through. Soon, she was not only strategizing high-stakes campaigns, but also leading teams, inspiring those around her. Recognition followed her achievements, but in the chaos of constant motion, it became easy to forget how much she had sacrificed just to be seen. Her days were exhausting, but her pride in what she had built kept her moving forward. Things began to shift the day she was entrusted with a pivotal project, one that had the potential to redefine her standing in the company. At first, it seemed like an opportunity born of trust, but something in the atmosphere around her began to feel off. Colleagues she once considered allies started to look at her with a distance she couldn't explain. Celia, someone she had confided in for years, a friend who had been behind many of their shared creative breakthroughs, began acting strangely, pulling away. Lolita, ever the believer in honesty and effort, chose not to question it. She didn't want to believe betrayal could be blooming in the very space where she had given so much. The unraveling came through a single email. She opened it, expecting a routine message, but instead found a cruel confirmation of her suspicions. The project she had shaped, poured herself into, fought for, had been stripped from her hands. The praise, the credit, the celebration, all of it had been redirected to Celia. Every core idea, every strategic decision that had originated from Lolita was now paraded as Celia's triumph. There was no mention of Lolita's work, no gratitude, only silence. Worse, Celia had taken it a step further, submitting negative feedback about Lolita that questioned her leadership and tarnished her image in the eyes of the board. Lolita sat there, reading the lines again and again, unable to grasp how swiftly everything had been turned against her. The sting of betrayal in a professional world was something Lolita had never thought she'd feel. She had placed trust in the relationship she built, believed in the mutual respect of shared goals, but now she stood alone in that belief. Celia, who she had called a friend, had twisted the knife, and Marjorie, someone she had once looked up to like a mentor, stood silent behind Celia's rise, never once speaking up in her defense. One shock followed another until Lolita could barely keep her thoughts straight. Questions swirled in her head without answers. Why? What did I do wrong? And when she turned to the people she loved, hoping for even a sliver of understanding, she was met with the ache of abandonment instead. But it was the night she turned to Alaric that shattered her in ways the others hadn't. He was her confidant, her anchor, someone she had believed would always hold space for her pain. She needed him to see her, to believe in her. She sat with him, letting the storm inside her spill into words, but he only listened. He didn't argue, didn't accuse, but he also didn't shield her. His response was simple, too simple. Perhaps she should accept it and focus on what she still had. It was the first time Lolita felt truly alone. His words, though soft, cut into her with an edge that silenced even her grief. The betrayal at work was brutal, but the quiet dismissal from someone she loved was far worse. She sat alone in her silent apartment, cold fingers wrapped around a forgotten cup of coffee. Her thoughts spun in endless circles, chaotic and sharp like a storm that would not pass. She had once believed her career and her relationships would lead her toward a future filled with color and possibility. But now, all she could see were the scattered fragments of a dream that had broken without warning. The loneliness pressed in with each breath, the sense of loss, of being discarded, of watching everything slip through her fingers, left her frozen in place, uncertain of any next step. Everything had shifted in a single moment. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. No rope, no hand reaching down, no way forward. Even her connection with Alaric, once so grounding, now seemed to fade into a past she could no longer touch. That bond had become like a shadow she couldn't escape. No matter how far she ran, the betrayal in the workplace, the abandonment from the man she had once leaned on, they had stripped her of her faith, her voice, even her sense of self. Lolita no longer knew who she was in a world where ambition wore friendship as a mask, and silence passed for loyalty. So she stared at what was left, and though it tore her apart, she began to ask herself the hardest question of all. Could anything that was lost ever be reclaimed? Lolita sat still in the quiet of her workspace as the light outside dimmed with the approaching evening. The pain no longer gripped her as it once did, and the shocks that had once seemed relentless had finally given way to something steadier, something quieter. After countless sleepless nights and long days of avoiding her own reflection, she began to see a truth she had refused to accept before. If she stayed buried beneath the weight of her own hurt, if she kept feeding the narrative of failure and betrayal, she would never find her way out of the darkness. That realization, quiet but resolute, was the moment everything shifted. She decided then that she would change, not for anyone else, but for herself. She told no one. Every step she took happened in silence, not as a performance, but as part of a strategy she knew had no room for retreat. She had once trusted the strength of relationships, the belief that help would come from others, but that belief had faded. Success, she now understood, could not depend on the goodwill of people who might vanish when it mattered most. She would rebuild alone. The first step was to erase the past, beginning with Alaric. She didn't cut him off out of anger, but because she could no longer live in a connection built on what used to be. The old messages, the shared memories, they were no longer anchors, but reminders of what she had lost. To move forward, she had to stop looking back. The second step was beginning from zero. She rented a small office, found freelance work, and launched her own modest practice, no longer a corporate title holder, no longer the leader of polished campaigns. She started over as simply herself, and strangely, that brought her peace. She spent days relearning everything, diving back into marketing strategies, creative frameworks, and industry shifts she once took for granted. The knowledge she had gathered over the years became her arsenal, not as decoration, but as tools she would now wield on her own terms. The days were not kind. In the beginning, there were no teams to brainstorm with, no assistants to rely on, no familiar voices to consult. Every task rested on her shoulders alone. She felt the weight of it in every decision, every late night, every silent morning, but still, she did not stop. Each day began with the quiet discipline of someone who had something to prove, but only to herself. She no longer carried the weakness of her former self. She learned to stand firm, to solve, to move forward without waiting for someone else to clear the path. The hardship wasn't limited to the workload. Financial pressure followed her like a shadow. Clients delayed payments. Partners broke promises. The instability crept in from every corner. But Lolita refused to let herself fall back into despair. She had learned that endurance, more than brilliance, was the thing that mattered most. Along the way, there were doubters, people who looked at her with skepticism, who whispered that someone like her couldn't possibly recover from a fall like the one she had taken. Some even scoffed at her ambition, as if her failure had marked her permanently. But she didn't let those opinions linger in her mind. She knew what they didn't, that the only response worth giving was results. Every milestone she reached, no matter how small, was a step in reclaiming her voice. Then one day, while working late, she received a call from a former partner company. They had been following her progress, had seen how she'd revived small brand strategies, and now wanted to collaborate on larger campaigns. It was the opening she had been preparing for. She felt no surprise, only a calm readiness. She had done the work. She had earned this when the formal proposal arrived. Lolita read it without trembling hands or racing heart. What she felt was not a rush of excitement, but a quiet satisfaction that settled deep inside her. This was not luck. This was the result of persistence, of rebuilding from nothing without shortcuts or borrowed power. This time, she would not stand behind someone else's glossy image. She would lead. She would build. She would decide what came next. And in that moment, she understood something profound. She no longer needed permission. She had carved her own lane, paved her own way. She had changed. The failures and betrayals, all of them, had become lessons folded into her spine. She hadn't just recovered. She had become stronger. She no longer looked back, because everything she needed was in front of her now, waiting, as she stepped forward into the life she had chosen to rebuild with her own two hands. Lolita could feel every beat of her heart as she held the partnership contract in her hands. It was as if time had slowed, as if everything she had been through had led her precisely to this moment. Yet she knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the real trials were only starting now, after years of being dismissed, after countless efforts that went unseen. She now stood before a chance to rewrite everything. On the first day of launching her new marketing campaign, the difference was immediate. The partner company, once skeptical of her ability, began to reassess their assumptions. The strategies she proposed quickly proved their worth. New clients came in, new contracts followed, and with each step forward, she reclaimed ground she thought was lost. Being recognized again was something she hadn't dared to imagine after so many years operating in silence. But just as she reached the threshold of this new success, something shifted. Celia had never been one to let things go. Still wrapped in the protection of powerful figures within their old company, she began maneuvering behind the scenes. At first, it came disguised as harmless calls, filled with feigned curiosity about Lolita's work. But it didn't take long before the real intention emerged. Every strategy Lolita rolled out was being watched, picked apart, dissected not for improvement, but for weakness, even though the results were exceeding all expectations. One afternoon, as she sat in her office with a warm cup of coffee, Lolita received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but laced with disdain. "I thought you should know. Your ideas aren't as flawless as you think. People are talking." It was Celia. The same false sweetness, the same calculated tone. But this time, Lolita heard something else beneath the surface, something brittle, and instead of hurt, she felt only a cold awareness, a sharp clarity about what was unfolding. The calls kept coming. More voices began to echo the same pattern, pointing fingers at supposed failures in her strategy, questioning every decision, tearing apart details that had once seemed solid. Her former company began quietly reaching out to potential partners, casting doubt, planting hesitation. Familiar faces grew distant. People she once collaborated with now turned cold, indifferent, unreachable. It was a familiar feeling, as if the same cycle of sabotage was repeating itself. But Lolita was no longer the woman who once froze in place and let her fate be decided for her. She chose not to crumble. Instead, she gathered every detail she could: emails, contracts, traces of communication, anything that could expose the truth. She knew words alone wouldn't be enough against Celia and her shield of influence. What she needed was evidence, undeniable proof of misconduct, of quiet manipulation, of a system still trying to erase her. The turning point came in the form of an anonymous email. It was a transcript from an internal meeting at her former company, outlining efforts to lure her new partners away and replace her with Celia, even going so far as to replicate the exact marketing model she had built. It was the crack she had been waiting for, the glimpse behind the curtain that made everything clear. Not long after, another blow arrived. A trusted partner reached out with concerns about irregularities in the financial reports related to Celia's active campaigns. Money had been misappropriated, cleverly masked within the budgets of former projects Lolita had once overseen before her departure. The documents pointed directly to malpractice. The quiet weight of it settled into her chest. It was time not just to defend, but to strike. She had prepared for this. She contacted a team of sharp, experienced attorneys who had been watching closely and were ready to act together. They built a case not on opinion, but on irrefutable documentation. Every step was calculated, every move designed to reveal, not accuse. The silence from Celia's side grew louder. Emails went unanswered. Calls stopped. Their confidence had turned into unease. Lolita's quiet, precise preparation was shaking their sense of control. And when the final blow came, when the falsified reports and unethical practices were brought to light, the damage could no longer be contained. The very people who once stood behind closed doors, protected by reputation and power, now had to face the consequences of the deception they had so long relied upon. Lolita didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to explain or justify. Her actions had spoken for her, and that was enough. Lolita sat alone in her office as the soft glow of her desk lamp spread across the documents she had spent days preparing. The stillness that once paralyzed her had faded, replaced by a calm and unwavering determination. With each passing day, she felt herself moving closer to the goal she had set, and now, all her preparation had reached its moment of reckoning. The pain, the sleepless nights, the sting of betrayal had crystallized into a quiet fire that pushed her forward. She was no longer proving anything to others. This was for herself. Celia and her allies at the old company had never imagined Lolita would rise again. They had convinced themselves she would disappear into failure, never to return. But their betrayal had become the very force that propelled her into boldness. She was no longer the naive woman who believed merit alone would carry her. Now, she moved with sharp awareness, with calculated clarity, and with a relentless will to not just survive, but prevail. That day, when she received the message from her legal team, a faint smile crossed her face. It was the signal she had been waiting for. Everything was in place. The files were ready, complete with detailed records of misappropriated funds, forged financial reports, and bank transfers that traced directly to Celia's account. These were not rumors or assumptions. They were hard, unshakable facts, compiled with meticulous care, not only by her lawyers, but also with the help of former partners she still trusted. There was no room left for denial. Lolita felt the tension rise, but it no longer unsettled her. Anxiety had no place in her anymore. In its stead stood clarity and control. She knew what came next would change everything. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration. And this time, she was not alone. Former colleagues who had once turned away now returned to stand beside her. They had seen the truth in her silence, in her resilience. A wave of quiet support gathered around her, and she walked into it without hesitation, as if destined. It all aligned on the final day of the month, when every preparation had been checked and double-checked. Lolita opened her email, composed a single line, and hit send. It's time. Let's move. And just like that, the road to justice unfolded. Betrayal had tried to break her, but instead, it had become the spark. She rose not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been cast aside, misused, or silenced. The journey ahead would not stop here. Every move from this moment would be deliberate, fueled by fairness, persistence, and the belief that integrity still had a place in business. The next day, in a meeting room filled with partners, lawyers, and allies, Lolita launched her legal response. The sneers and insults that once haunted her no longer carried weight. Every statement delivered was clear and confident, and one by one, the staged illusions built by Celia and her accomplices began to unravel. There were no threats, no theatrics, just the truth, laid bare through action. A week later, as news outlets began covering the fallout from the scandal at her former company, Lolita sat quietly in her modest office, eyes fixed on her computer screen. The headlines, the analyst commentaries, the voices of validation that once doubted her, now they spoke her name with respect. She had not returned for applause, but the recognition was no longer noise. It was acknowledgement. Lolita had come back stronger, not to take revenge, but to reclaim what had always belonged to her, the right to stand, to speak, and to lead. This time not under someone else's shadow, but fully in her own light. Lolita stood before the glass window of her office, looking out at the city that bustled and rushed just as it always had. But today, everything carried a different meaning. She was no longer the one standing outside, peering in with hope. She no longer waited for recognition or praise. She had already proven herself through her resilience, her skill, and her quiet strength. For Lolita, this return was not a spectacle, not a loud declaration. It was the quiet reward of every deliberate step she had taken. There had been no direct confrontation, no need for justification or drama. She had chosen another path, one measured by results. She didn't have to explain her worth anymore because her actions had already spoken with clarity. The campaign she had designed and launched had become an undeniable success. The very partners who once doubted her were now offering her their respect. Not only because the strategy had succeeded, but because she had returned, stronger and more grounded than ever, while her former company struggled to contain the internal fractures exposed by the financial discrepancies she had so carefully revealed. Lolita had already moved on. Celia, once considered a friend, now faced the consequences of her own making. The powerful connections she once relied on had begun to abandon her. The same manipulations that once helped her rise were now unraveling. Everything Celia had built her relationships. Her position was beginning to crumble piece by piece. The cracks inside the very institution that once pushed Lolita out were now impossible to ignore. Yet there was no satisfaction for Lolita in watching someone else fall. She understood that revenge was never about the ruin of an enemy. It was about standing firm in your own truth. She didn't feel joy at Celia's downfall, but somewhere within her, she recognized the inevitability of it. Deception always bears its own weight, and the reckoning does not arrive through noise or fury, but through the unavoidable reality of consequence. And Lolita, by refusing to fight with fire and instead letting her results speak for themselves, had earned a victory far more enduring. Her company was no longer a modest operation. It had become a name recognized not only for its creative strategies, but for the integrity behind them. Former clients who once distanced themselves had returned, not for convenience, but because they could see something real, an approach built on substance, on honesty, on the refusal to compromise values for short-term gains. In a key meeting with a potential client, when she stood to present, her gaze held steady and her voice carried no strain. She didn't need to sell herself with elaborate words. The numbers, the outcomes, the impact, those told the story better than she ever could. The room remained quiet, and then came the nods of agreement. There was no need to prove herself anymore. They all saw it. They were in the presence of someone who had not only talent, but execution and a heart that had endured. Celia, once standing at the height of her influence, now had to face the fallout. The mistakes could no longer be buried. The deceit, the manipulation, it had been laid bare. Lolita's former company had begun to receive inquiries from authorities, and though Celia tried to preserve her facade, the truth had already taken hold. She was no longer the victor. What she had built had been hollow all along, and now it was collapsing from the inside, piece by fragile piece. Lolita felt no triumph in this. She had once carried the pain of being pushed aside, but now she understood that real justice didn't look like revenge. It looked like peace. She had overcome herself, and that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. She had chosen the harder path, one of integrity, of persistence, and in the end, she had rebuilt everything from a foundation that could not be shaken. Her company now stood as proof of what could be created through clarity and discipline and belief in something genuine. Looking back on the road she had walked, Lolita felt neither bitterness nor grief, only peace, a peace deeper than anything she had ever known. She had not punished, had not lashed out, had not sought to destroy. She had simply walked forward with steadiness and quiet purpose. Because Lolita had come to understand one thing: simple but profound, the ones who endure with honesty, who hold their ground without compromising who they are the ones who win in the end.